As Delirium League is finally starting to come to a close for me, I have played pretty much every Ascendancy at this point, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to try and rank them into a tier list based on how strong I think they are, how versatile, how much they can do in the game, and how well-rounded they are. I basically came up with 5 criteria to judge them on, and at the end of the day, this is all subjective on my own opinion. You might have an entirely different opinion of how you like Ascendancies or what you think's better, and that's perfectly okay. So don't feel like if I say something to bat is a D tier and you think it's an S tier, don't feel like you can't play that build. Definitely still feel free to make a build with it. There's builds that, or there's Ascendancies I'm going to rank in the D and F tiers that you can still make very good builds with. So don't feel limited by it. To start with, the 5 criteria I chose were: is it versatile? Can it do a wide variety of builds? The second criteria I said, is it the best at something? Like, a lot of times Ascendancies come with a an archetype or some sort of build defining thing. They're like, this is, you see Deadeye, Deadeye, that's the bow character type of thing, and is it the best at what it's supposed to be the best at, or is it the best at multiple different things? The next criteria I chose was, is it well-rounded? Does it have both offensive and defensive capabilities, and is it good at both things? After that, I chose powerful as a grading criteria. That's arbitrarily just on my own opinion. If I think, hey, it has this niche, if there's another Ascendancy that has a similar niche, at the end of the day, does this one end up usually being the more powerful Ascendancy when I'm choosing to build? And dead nodes. Dead nodes is basically, if the Ascendancy has nodes that are just feel bad to pick up or aren't really worth it, or you feel like you're forced to pick certain nodes type of thing, stuff like that will make me give it a low score for dead nodes, as in, like, this could be reworked or fixed in some way. So those are the criteria I chose to grade them from, and each of those categories they can get 0 to 3. So a max score of 15, I said that's an S tier. A score of 13 to 14, that's an A tier, and then so on and so forth, all the way from B, C, D to F. That's how I'm grading these things. That's how I'm putting it together. I originally recorded this earlier, and it turned into a 50-minute video, so I'm going to try to just do a much shorter version of this, where I just basically give my shorthand thoughts about why I ranked things I did. So let's start it off. To start off with Ascendant. This thing's going into the D tier for me. Ascendant is commonly known as, it's a jack of all trades, but it's a master of none. If I'm thinking about making a build, I can think, oh, I could do this with Scion, but then I gauge it against other Ascendancies I could use, and the other Ascendancies are just far stronger than Scion is, because of, it's basically choosing 2 Ascendancy notables versus 4, but you get a couple extra passives, and at the end of the day, I really end up feeling that most other Ascendancies can do whatever build you're going to do, Scion can do, but they'll do it better. So I'm not really counting Herald stacking. At the end of the day, same for Guardian, this will be the case. Using Herald stacking, although these are the go-to Ascendancies, Guardian, Ascendant, in my mind, that doesn't really make the Ascendancy better. That's just Purposeful Harbinger carrying the Ascendancy on its back just because they had a node that could get somewhat abused, like the physical damage that gets stuck to every aura, or the physical damage reduction that gets stuck to every aura, or the attack and cast speed from Necromancer. Stuff like that, it gets heavily abused, and it's not really about the strength of the Ascendancy at that point. That's about Purposeful Harbinger. So at the end of the day, Ascendant is a D tier for me. Next up, we have Assassin. Assassin I put all the way at A tier. Assassin had pretty high flying colors, or scores across the board mostly. The only thing where it didn't rank it well was on versatility. I gave it a 2 instead of a 3 because at the end of the day, every node on Assassin is all about crit, so that does feel somewhat limited. Although you can do a lot of different spell builds, attack builds, at the end of the day, it's all based around crit. So Assassin's crit at the end of the day, and that I gave it a little bit less score on versatility, as well as well-roundedness. I said it lost points because it's very heavily skewed towards offense. Although it has some good defensive aspects, it's very heavily skewed to one spectrum. So it ended up solidly in the A tier for me. Next up, Berserker. Berserker, on my grading scale, didn't too hot, maybe. I mean, I like Berserker a lot, but it ended up in C tier when I graded it, and that's basically because for a few things. So to begin with, versatile, I gave it just a 2 because it does attack, it does speed, which that can be bow skills, melee skills. There's a lot of, variety in attack skills, but at the end of the day, it was pretty limited to being physical attack, no spell diversity there, so I gave it a 2. Is it the best at something? Yeah, it's the best at DPS, and it's the best at dying. So I gave it a 3 for that. For its well-roundedness, I gave it a 1 because it feels good offensively, but it has it feels so bad defensively. In my mind, although it has great sustain with stuff like Warbringer, the second you pick up Aspect of the Carnage, and you don't not pick up Aspect of the Carnage because it's such a good node, but the second you pick that up, you start dying to one-shots, and no amount of sustain you get from Warbringer or some other nodes like Leech are going to protect you from the one-shots, and you're going to end up just dying more if you're a Berserker. It's the price you pay for the damage you get. So, Berserker, C tier for me. Next up is Champion. Champion, again, made it to the A tier for me. Champion, in my mind, is just a very well-rounded, strong character. It's got the ability to be a support character, melee powerhouse, bow fortify. It's got a lot of versatility there, and it's generally the best at things like Impale, things that involve hits can't be evaded, abuse. Although it's easier to hit chance cap now than it was previously. It used to be, this was very strong because you get hits can't be evaded, and that used to be a lot harder to achieve. But now it's a little less strong, but I still think it's a very well-rounded Ascendancy. You get a lot of flat armor, a lot of flat evasion with a lot of the nodes you can get. So the only place that lost points for me was in dead nodes, and that's because of Fortitude and Inspirational. I usually don't see a reason to pick up Inspirational, generally speaking. Most of the other nodes are stronger, so it feels kind of like a dead node to me. And then Fortitude only feels good on a bow build. Other builds you can pick up melee, just from Fortify support, which is very strong, and at the end of the day, Fortify support versus using Fortitude as the node is like a 10% more damage difference based on a different support jewel you could, or gem you could use at that point. So, Champion, solid A tier for me. Next up, Chieftain. This was my first Ascendancy I ever chose. I thought it was very, very cool thematically. A bear, man, fire. I thought it was very cool, but wait, what am I doing? Okay, yeah, okay, it did make it into the C tier. Barely into the C tier, though. For me, versatile, I gave it a 0. At the end of the day, it seems like if you're not dealing fire damage, you're not going Chieftain, and that seems like a very limited focus to me, so I gave it a 0 on that. For is it the best at something, I ended up giving it a 2, because I feel like a lot of times you can make a Chieftain character, but you can make a more deadly character of something else. A lot of times I don't feel at the end of the day, if I make a Chieftain character, that it was necessarily the best it could be. Sometimes I think, oh, I could have made maybe a more deadly character with Assassin, stuff like that. Next up, if you look for well-rounded defensive characters, although I'm ranking it poorly for these other things, I think it's one of those Ascendancies that always feels well-rounded at the end of the day. You always feel like you got some offense. You always feel like you're a pretty tanky, chunky dude. So I gave it a 3 for that. And then it fell apart for me when it came to dead nodes because of the totem nodes. At the end of the day, if I'm making a totem build, I'm not making Chieftain. I feel like Hierophant is just so much stronger. And on top of that, those nodes aren't usable outside of totems, so they just feel like dead nodes usually. There's a few janky scenarios where you can try to make totem builds work with Chieftain, but I just feel like you're better off with a Hierophant or even a Scion, which the Scion's pretty rough to begin with. And then on Powerful, I just gave it a pretty strong. I gave it a 2, because a lot of times I feel like there's stronger options that you can go with. Next up, we have Deadeye, which this might be kind of controversial because Deadeye's been king for a lot of people for a lot of builds, but I'm putting it in C tier based on the criteria I had. I gave it a 1 for versatility because it seems pretty limited to just bow skills or projectile skills and attack based, and to me that feels pretty limited. Not quite as limited as just being fire skills, but at the end of the day it still seems pretty limited. Is it the best at something? Yeah, it's the best at clear, it's the best at speed, projectiles, stuff like that. I feel like it's king. As for well-rounded, again, I gave it a 2 because it's great offensively and it's great for clear, but I feel like whenever I make Deadeyes, a lot of the times they get one shot, usually. I mean, you spec into some invasion here and there and it works and it feels good and you're clearing the map and it feels good, but then you run into one attack and you die and you don't evade it and you get one shot. And so it didn't feel well-rounded for defensive. And then for dead nodes, I gave it a 1 just because of powerful precision. I never feel like that's the node to pick up. A lot of times I feel like you can get projectile pierce in a lot of different places on the tree and cluster jewels. I don't feel like it's very useful compared to a lot of the other nodes, especially since usually when you're going Deadeye, you want to do something with a chain abuse just for all that good and satisfying clear. And because of that, I gave it a 1 for dead nodes. And so Deadeye ended up in C tier. Maybe it could have made it into B tier if I wasn't so harsh on the dead nodes thing. Maybe I should have just given it a 2 there, but what's done is done. It's C tier for me. Elementalist next up. It's going to go into the D tier. And this, I feel bad about doing. but because I really like an Elementalist. But at the end of the day, the problem with Elementalist is golems and dead nodes. Golems are a problem because they just die. With rippy mechanics, they die, and when your golems die, your builds die. Because a lot of times, if you're doing a Elementalist of some sort, your damage and defense heavily revolves around the golem buffs. And once those go down, you go down, and they just die. Even with very heavy spec'd in life for those things, I had like 200% increased life for my golems on my tree, and they would still die in the serious fight, even being immune to elemental damage, just because a bleed would kill them. And once they died, I'd have to run away like a little chicken, and I'd have to go resummon them, or I would just get one shot at that point because all my defenses would be gone, all my phys reduction would be gone, stuff like that. So it's unreliable there, and then on top of that, it has dead nodes and has limited versatility. It has to be elemental, so I gave it a 2 in versatility, and on top of that, it has a lot of dead nodes. The Paragon of Calamity I almost never pick up because I feel like you have to go to the second node on the double node branches, because the mediary node in the middle of those is always kind of bad, and it's basically a travel node to a much stronger ascendancy node type of deal. So at the end of the day, one, having those traveling nodes always feel bad to pick up, making it awkward to pick up Paragon of Calamity. And then I gave a pretty low score on dead nodes as well. So Elementalist is D tier, unfortunately. If they make it so you can reliably keep your golems alive more consistently, like in Necromancers where they have specters that don't really die, if you have that type of scenario with golems, then I could consider this, it could be a lot closer to A tier with how good those golem buffs are. But with golems constantly dying, it's just a pain. Gladiator is going to be our first B tier. I don't make too many gladiators, but when I do, they generally feel pretty well rounded. They feel good at attack-based builds, but usually I feel like I can make stronger attack-based builds with Champion, with Slayer, with Berserker in terms of offenses or even defenses. And although I like block a lot, it's the same thing with kind of evasion, where it feels good up until you don't block or until you don't evade, and in those scenarios, the character dies. So I put it in the solid B tier. I like Gladiator, but it falls short in some of the more power aspects where I think there's better options out there for what its class is. Although it is king of block, that is for sure. Now for Guardian. I love Guardian. This is either one of the ascendancies I've made the most times, or I've made second most times. I made a lot of Guardians, and I'm putting it in the F tier. Although it had its reign of glory in the brief moments before they nerfed Purposeful Harbinger, abusing or basically multiplying all of its nodes by 5 type of deal. In that brief moment of glory, it was the king, but aside from that, I feel like Guardians are just support characters for your minions or for your friends or your party. And at the end of the day, I don't really feel like that's a build. I don't really want to play a build where I'm just supporting things all the time. That doesn't feel like that's much versatility there. And also, I feel like it's not even necessarily the strongest at those things. I feel like Necromancers are generally a better minion ascendancy. And then on top of that, there's better support ascendancies, which is Ascendant. Ascendant's generally a better support ascendancy. One thing Guardian does well, I think, is like a defensive support. But aside from that, I feel like the nodes on Guardian are just kind of weak in comparison. So it is the king of F tier right now, unfortunately, as much as I love Guardian in my mind. Next up, we have Hierophant. Now, Hierophant, I put into C tier. Hierophant, for me, the reason... Hierophant, you get a lot of strong builds out of it. For example, the mana Archmage stuff is extremely strong. A lot of totem builds are usually extremely strong. I didn't put this higher because I feel like, more or less, Archmage, similar to Purposeful Harbinger abuse, Archmage is just an overpowered mechanic, and that's not necessarily the reason Hierophant's good right now, or it's not necessarily because Hierophant's good, it's because Archmage is good. And Hierophant also feels pretty limited in what you can do with it. It's mana, it's spell, it's totem. And on top of that, some of its spell nodes feel bad to pick up. Like, I never want to pick up the Arcane Blessing line of nodes where it gives you Life Leech and Elemental Immunity in Arcane Surge, because you can get Arcane Surge for free on a Flame Dash or a movement skill of any kind. And then on top of that, the spell damage and area of effect is kind of underwhelming for an Ascendancy notable. So it just kind of feels bad. Also, Hierophants end up being energy shield characters a lot of the time, and in which case energy shield leech can be picked up on one passive point on the tree, so the life leech doesn't necessarily feel that great. As well as elemental immunities can be picked up elsewhere, and you got to compare it to other builds that get elemental immunities, like Inquisitor, where his elemental immunity comes with attack speed, it comes with energy shield regen, it's got a lot of other benefits other than a level 1 arcane surge, which you can put on a movement skill. So Hierophant C tier for me. Next up, Inquisitor. I think Inquisitor is B tier. I felt like Inquisitor, it used to be A or even S tier before they started adding in a bunch of mechanics where you could lower enemies' resistance below 0 or penetrate resistance really easily. It used to be that stat was very hard to find, and Inquisitor was king. Since they've added so many ways to penetrate enemies' resistances below 0, Inquisitor starts to fall off the map and doesn't feel quite so strong. Although I still feel like it's a very well-rounded ascendancy and it does a lot of things well. I think often you can do more damage or have stronger characters in general with other ascendancies a lot of time. But I feel like all of its nodes are pretty well-rounded and it's a pretty balanced, scaled character in my mind. Next up, we have Juggernaut. Juggernaut is making it into A tier. In my mind, Juggernaut becomes super versatile because Juggernaut is super thick and he basically solves all your defensive problems, which allows you to have a lot of basically freedom of choice on how you build the character offensively, which can result in a ton of different build dynamics going on there. So I feel like Juggernauts end up all over the tree. You see him with How a Claw builds. You see him with Herald of Agony builds. You see them with Stun Jugs. You see them with Righteous Fire characters. They can do a lot because their build basically allows them a lot of freedom in their offensive choices, which ends up being the skill your build is built around. Also, it's the best at being tanky. I took off some points for overall. I feel like power level, you don't see Jugs on the high end of offensive DPS craziness. You see that in Berserkers, Assassins, other builds, although I feel like it's a very well-rounded, strong character. So it's in the A tier for me. Next up, we have Necromancer. For me, Necromancer made it into the B tier. It was just shy of A tier. The things holding him back where I felt like versatility, all it does is minions, and that's for me that feels like a pretty limited scope, and some detonate dead shenanigans. That feel like a limited scope there, so versatility was bad, and then I also subtracted a point for Essence Glutton. That to me is a dead node, so instead of getting a 3 there, because most of the nodes are pretty usable and pretty good, but Essence of Glutton I feel like I don't feel like there's too many scenarios where I think it's worth picking up, and therefore it doesn't make a very high score, and for getting 3 for having no dead nodes in my mind. So just shy of A tier. Next up we have Occultist. This one did make it into A tier, so at least one witch made it into the A tier, and that's basically because I feel like it's pretty versatile. It can do cold, it can do chaos, it can do dot skills, it can do crit skills, it can do curses, and curses are also well-rounded in defensive and offensive attributes to them. So I feel like Occultist has a lot of generic strength to it and ends up being the strong in a few different categories. So I put it all the way up in A tier, and I like Occultist. I think it's pretty good. Next up, Pathfinder. I think Pathfinder, in my mind, Pathfinder's strength is all about flasks. So if there's strong flasks in the game, then Pathfinder feels strong. And I feel like there's a decent amount of strong flasks. So Pathfinder, in my mind, it ends up making it into the A tier just because flasks have a lot of versatility to them. You can go a lot of routes with flasks. And at the end of the day, if you're min-maxing some abuse on flasks, Pathfinder's your choice. It's your only choice, really. Scion is a choice you don't want to make and you never should make. So at the end of the day, I feel like Pathfinder's an A tier just because of how strong flasks are and how much you can do with them. Next up, Raider. Raider I feel like can be good, but it's a C tier for me because Raider sucks at bosses with phases or invulnerability this or dialogue options. Raider just feels so bad because you have to generate your frenzy charges, your onslaught. You have to get that stuff going, and until you do that, the first 5-10 seconds of the fight feel horrible, and you're at a very vulnerable stage where you're not attacking fast, you're not doing damage, and it just feels bad. In my mind, if there was a more consistent way to have that stuff up, even though you have to pause, like for Cirrus, you have like 4 invulnerability phases where each time you lose your charges and you have to re-get those at the start of the fight, it's a very dangerous time for you. Just because of that alone, although Raider, it feels perfect while mapping, it feels amazing, but the second you get to bosses with phases or any drops in your frenzy charges type of deal, then it feels bad, and for that, it ended up dying for me, and I graded it pretty harshly into the C tier. Lastly, Saboteur. Saboteur is a similar thing to Necromancer, where I feel like its niche is traps and mines, but it actually made it into the A tier for me. And the reason for that is Saboteur, in my mind, didn't really have dead nodes. I could see a time and place for all the nodes it had, and I gave it a little bit higher score and versatility than Necromancer. I gave it a 1 instead of a 0, solely because with traps and mines, although it is traps and mines, you can do attacks, you can do spells, you can do a ton of variety within the scope of traps and mines. So it's, in my mind, still made it into A tier, and it's very powerful, very strong, just like Necromancer is very powerful and very strong in its category. Now for Slayer. Slayer is actually going to be our first S tier. I don't know if this is controversial or not, but in my mind, Slayer is one of those Ascendancy where I always have a hard time picking my nodes, not because I'm deciding between two bad choices, but I'm deciding between two pretty good choices, and it feels good defensively. It's got stun bleed immunity. You can get overleech if you want. You can get, you can fix your weapon's crit chance, so you can make a lot of builds around weapons that have bad crit chance. So for example, you can take a Starforge with 5 crit and make it 7.5, and that's a very strong thing to have. So in my mind, Slayer is one of those Ascendancies where you can't really go wrong with your attack builds. It can pretty much do whatever attack type of build you want, and it can do it well with a lot of good choices in your nodes. And on top of that, I've even seen pretty interesting and strong spell builds. For example, the Josis one Quackman build, I think of that as an example, where he took like 10 or 11 Endurance, Frenzy, and Power charges using Masterful Form. Very interesting and very cool. So Slayer's an S tier for me. It's well-rounded and it's strong. Next up, and this I would probably, if I could, I'd almost rank it higher than Slayer, is Trickster. And Trickster is filling out another S tier for me. Trickster, in my mind, it's like Slayer in that it has all of the perks of having a lot of good choices to make, but on top of that, I think it has even more versatility than Slayer does. Slayer is kind of like, it's got all the choices you can do in the world for doing an attack-based build, but in my mind, Trickster can do both attack-based, it can do spell-based, it can do damage over time spell-based, it can do it all in my mind. There's not too many builds I don't think I could do with the Trickster. And on top of that, it's usually a pretty compelling choice for a lot of those categories, and it's also very strong in some of its major suits. Like some damage over time builds, Trickster is the one to go. Scorching Ray, in my mind, that's a Trickster build. Righteous Fire, in a lot of ways, Trickster's the tier 1 Ascendancy for me. You have Eternity Shroud builds, Trickster, tier 1 for me. There's a lot of ways that Trickster ends up being king in my mind, so that's kind of how I'd rank it. At the end of the day, I don't know if this is very skewed. I don't know if it should look more of like a mountain or whatever, with more hovering around the B and C tier. I do have a lot of A tier things here, but this is probably, after the fact, this is how I'd rank them. And I feel like all the Ascendancies have something to give. At the end of the day, you can still make very compelling builds with Guardian. Even though I ranked it in the F tier, you can make some very compelling builds with Ascendant, with Elementalist, with Raider, with Hierophant, with Deadeye, with Chieftain, with Berserker. A lot of these Ascendancies are all good in a lot of different ways. Based on my grading criteria, this is kind of what I came up with after playing pretty much every Ascendancy this league. At the end of the day, I like them all. I have fun playing different builds with a lot of different Ascendancies. That's how I'd rank them. Let me know, guys, what you think about various Ascendancies, how you'd rank them, or if you think I shafted one, you think they should be up higher or whatnot. But yeah, this is how I'd rank the Ascendancies in 3.10 Delirium League. We'll see if they do any changes for next league, or when PoE 2 comes out, there'll be a whole nother 19 Ascendancies, and that'll be real fun to go through and see how I'd rank those in comparison to these ones, type of deal. So y'all have a good day. Hope you enjoyed the tier list, and I'll see you in the next video.